I never expected to find my mother's journal buried beneath the hydrangeas. 40 years she'd been gone and still, she found ways to speak to me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what James always said was my problem, rushing to the end before appreciating the journey. After 43 years of marriage, I thought I knew everything about my husband. I was wrong. My name is Eleanor Coldwell. Most people call me Ellie, except for James, who always insisted on my full name. Eleanor is elegant, he'd say. It commands respect. Perhaps that should have been my first clue that appearances mattered too much to him. Our house on Maple Street wasn't grand, but it was home. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, with the kind of worn wooden floors that creak in just the right places to let you know you belong. We raised our 2 children here. Michael, now a successful architect in Boston, and Sarah, a pediatrician in Chicago. Both too busy to visit more than twice a year, but they call. Usually. The morning everything changed began like any other Tuesday. I woke at 6:15, 15 minutes before the alarm, as I had for most of my adult life. James was already in the shower, the steam seeping under the bathroom door like morning fog. I made the bed with hospital corners, just as my mother had taught me, and went downstairs to prepare breakfast. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast with butter on the side, black coffee, I whispered to myself, setting the table with the blue placemats we'd received as a wedding gift. The familiar routine was comforting, like a well-worn path through the woods. James came down at precisely 6:45. His silver hair damp but perfectly combed, wearing the navy suit I'd ironed the night before. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, placing a dry kiss on my cheek before sitting down. He opened his newspaper. Yes, he still insisted on a physical newspaper, creating a wall between us. "The Watson fundraiser is tonight," I reminded him, pouring his coffee. "Don't forget we need to leave by 6. Came the non-committal response from behind the business section. I settled into my chair with my own coffee and a piece of toast with strawberry jam. The tart sweetness was a small pleasure in a morning of routine. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Peterson walking her terrier, bundled in a purple coat despite the mild spring weather. Some habits die hard, I suppose. "I'll be working late tonight," James said suddenly, folding his newspaper precisely along its original creases. "Don't wait up for the fundraiser. Go with Margaret instead." Paused mid-bite. "But we RSVP'd together. Janet Watson specifically asked if you'd be there to discuss the library renovation." James checked his watch. A Rolex. His retirement gift to himself after 35 years as a corporate attorney. "I can't help it, Eleanor. The Harrison brief needs work before tomorrow's meeting." I nodded, swallowing disappointment along with my toast. It wasn't the first time James had backed out of our plans, especially lately. At 67, he was supposedly semi-retired, but the firm still called, and he still answered. "I'll call Margaret," I said, though we both knew she was visiting her daughter in Portland this week. James stood, straightening his tie. "I'm sure you'll manage. You always do." He gathered his briefcase and was gone with another perfunctory kiss, leaving behind the faint scent of his sandalwood aftershave and questions I didn't ask. The house felt emptier than usual after he left. At 65, I'd grown accustomed to the quietness of our nest since the children moved out, but today the silence felt oppressive. I cleaned the breakfast dishes with more force than necessary, then changed into gardening clothes, faded jeans and one of James's old Oxford shirts that I'd claimed years ago. The garden had become my sanctuary since retirement. After 30 years of teaching second grade, I needed something to nurture. The children had always been my life's work, but with them gone, the flowers filled a void. Each spring brought new possibilities, new growth. This particular Tuesday, I decided to tackle the overgrown hydrangea bed along the eastern fence. The soil was cool beneath my fingers as I dug around the base of the largest bush, pulling weeds and loosening packed earth. The physical labor felt good, grounding. The sun warmed my back as birds argued in the maple tree overhead. For a moment, I forgot about James's cancellation, about the way his eyes now slid past me when we talked, about the growing distance between us that neither acknowledged. Then my trowel hit something solid. At first I thought it was a rock, common enough in our New England soil. But as I scraped away the dirt, I realized it was a box. A metal lockbox, rusted at the edges but intact. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a hardcover book, but heavy for its size. "What on earth?" I murmured, pulling it free. The box had no distinguishing features except for a simple key lock on the front. Brushing off decades of soil, I carried it to the patio table, leaving muddy fingerprints on its surface. The lock was corroded but still held. After trying unsuccessfully to open it, I went to the garage for James's toolbox. It took 10 minutes of wrangling with a screwdriver and hammer before the lock finally gave way with a reluctant snap. I hesitated before opening the lid, strangely nervous. What treasure or trash had someone buried in our yard? And how long ago? Inside, protected by a plastic bag that had miraculously kept out the moisture, was a journal bound in faded green leather. The pages were yellowed but legible, filled with neat, flowing handwriting I recognized immediately. My mother's. My heart stuttered. My mother, Catherine Lewis, had died when I was 25. A sudden heart attack that left too many conversations unfinished. Finding her words now, buried in my garden, felt impossible. The date on the first page read April 12, 1979. I would have been 19 then, in my sophomore year of college. I turned the page and began to read. Today I confirmed what I've suspected for months. Richard is having an affair with Maureen Sanders, his secretary. How predictable, how absolutely cliché. 22 years of marriage, and he chooses the young blonde who laughs at his jokes and brings him coffee just the way he likes it. I nearly dropped the journal. Richard was my father, a stern but loving man who died 5 years after my mother from lung cancer. I had never, not once, suspected him of infidelity. My parents' marriage had seemed solid, unshakable. I won't confront him yet. Eleanor is home from college for spring break, and Michael is only 16. They worship their father. I won't destroy that image, not while I decide what to do. For now, I'll continue to be the perfect wife, the devoted mother. But inside, something has broken that I'm not sure can be fixed. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The garden suddenly seemed too bright, too exposed. I gathered the box and hurried inside, leaving my gardening tools scattered on the ground. In the kitchen, I washed my hands methodically, watching the dirt swirl down the drain. My mind raced with questions. Had my father really betrayed my mother? Had she forgiven him? Was their seemingly stable marriage a carefully constructed facade? And most troubling of all, why had she buried this journal in our garden? This wasn't even the house I grew up in. James and I had bought it after the children were born. I dried my hands and walked slowly to the living room, where our wedding photos sat in silver frames on the mantel. One showed the entire wedding party. James in his tuxedo, me in my mother's restored wedding gown, and both sets of parents beaming beside us. I peered closer at the background of the photo, at the garden where we'd held the ceremony. There, behind the wedding arch, was a hydrangea bush in full bloom. This had been my parents' home. The realization hit me like a physical blow. James and I had bought this house from my father after my mother died. He'd been eager to sell, claiming too many memories made it painful to stay. I'd been thrilled to raise our children in a place connected to my childhood, though we'd renovated extensively. The garden was the one area I'd left largely unchanged, out of respect for my mother's love of flowers. Had she known I would find her journal someday? Had she wanted me to? I settled onto the sofa with the journal on my lap, uncertain if I should continue reading. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. But my fingers seemed to have a will of their own as they turned to the next entry. April 18, 1979. Richard came home with diamond earrings today. His guilt wrapped in blue velvet. I accepted them with a smile that made my face ache. "What's the occasion?" I asked as though I didn't know. He mumbled something about appreciating me. 22 years, and only now does he think to appreciate me. I wore them to dinner, these symbols of his betrayal. Eleanor noticed immediately, complimented them. "Dad has good taste," she said. I nearly laughed. Yes, his taste runs to young, admiring women who don't challenge him, who haven't given him 2 children and 2 decades of their lives. Called Judith today. She thinks I should confront him, demand he end the affair or I'll leave. Easy for her to say with her trust fund and childless marriage. Where would I go? What would I do? I have no career, no money of my own. Richard controls everything. For now I'll wait. We'll watch. And I'll start planning. Because one way or another, I won't live like this forever. I read entry after entry. The afternoon slipping away unnoticed. My mother's words painted a picture of a woman I had never fully known. Intelligent, observant, trapped by circumstances and choices made when options for women were more limited. She detailed my father's affair, her growing resentment, and something else that made my blood run cold. Her suspicion that my father was embezzling from his company. June 3, 1979. I found the second set of books today while Richard was golfing. Hidden in the false bottom of his filing cabinet. Amateur hiding place, really. He's been skimming from the company pension fund for years. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. No wonder we could suddenly afford the lake house and his new car. What kind of man steals from his employees' futures? The same kind who betrays his wife, I suppose. The question is, what kind of woman am I? The kind who looks the other way? Or the kind who does something about it? The next entry was dated nearly 2 months later. July 28, 1979. Done. I've made copies of everything and mailed them to the district attorney. Anonymous, of course. Richard will never know it was me. By the time they come for him, I'll be gone. I've been moving money slowly. Cash back at the grocery store. Small withdrawals he won't notice. Nearly $3,000 hidden in the lockbox with this journal. Buried where he'll never look. Eleanor graduates next year. She'll be devastated when it happens, but she's strong. She'll survive. Michael will be harder. He idolizes his father. But better they know the truth than live with lies. Better they see that sometimes you have to make impossible choices. I found a small apartment in Burlington. Secretarial classes start in September. At 45 I'll start over. There's fear in that thought, but exhilaration too. I've been Catherine Lewis, devoted wife and mother for so long. Perhaps it's time to discover who else I might have been. But my mother never left. She died 5 years before my father was arrested for embezzlement. An investigation that apparently began with an anonymous tip but took years to complete. By then, I was married to James, building my own life, shocked by the revelation that my upstanding father was a criminal. No one ever connected my mother to the investigation. I had always assumed she died never knowing what kind of man she was married to. I was wrong. The final entry was dated just 1 week before her death. October 15, 1984. Richard knows. I don't know how he found out, but the look in his eyes tonight. I've never seen such cold fury. He didn't say anything, just stared at me across the dinner table with such hatred that I nearly confessed everything. But I didn't. I won't give him the satisfaction. I've moved the money from the lockbox. It's not much after all these years, but it's enough to get away. I'll leave tomorrow while he's at work. The bus ticket is bought. Eleanor is settled with her new husband. Such a serious young man, that James, but he adores her. Michael is in his first year at Connecticut State. They'll understand someday why I had to go. This will be my last entry. Whoever finds this journal, probably some future homeowner digging in the garden, know that I tried to do what was right. For my children. For myself. Sometimes courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it's a quiet voice saying, I will not live this way anymore. But she never got away. Her heart stopped as she slept, the coroner said. A genetic defect no one had detected. I remembered my father's grief seeming so genuine, so devastating. Had it been real? Or relief that his secret remained safe? I closed the journal, my thoughts a jumble of confusion and belated understanding. The mother I thought I knew, serene, accepting, devoted, had been planning an escape. She'd turned in her criminal husband. She'd been saving money, taking classes, preparing for independence. She'd been braver than I ever knew. The sound of the garage door opening jolted me back to the present. James was home. I quickly slid the journal under a sofa cushion, not ready to share this discovery. He entered through the kitchen, loosening his tie. "Eleanor, where are you?" "In the living room," I called, struggling to keep my voice normal. James appeared in the doorway, briefcase still in hand. "You're still in your gardening clothes. The fundraiser starts in an hour." I'd completely forgotten about Janet Watson's event. "I thought you had to work late." The meeting was rescheduled. He frowned, taking in my dirt-streaked jeans. "You should get ready. We don't want to be late." I nodded absently, my mind still with my mother's words. "I'll just be a minute." As I showered and dressed in the blue cocktail dress James preferred, I couldn't stop thinking about my mother's secret life. Her disillusionment, her quiet rebellion. The parallels to my own marriage were impossible to ignore. James and I moved through the evening like perfect automata. We smiled at the right moments, made appropriate small talk, donated a generous check to the library renovation. James kept his hand at the small of my back, guiding me through the crowd with practiced ease. "Eleanor and I are so pleased to support the arts in our community," he told Janet Watson. His public voice warm and engaged in a way it rarely was at home anymore. I studied him as he chatted about tax advantages of charitable giving. Who was this man I'd married? After finding my mother's journal, I found myself questioning everything. The late nights at the office. The separate bank account I wasn't supposed to ask about. The way he'd grown distant over the past few years. "Eleanor, don't you agree?" James was looking at me expectantly. "I'm sorry, what was the question?" His smile remained fixed, but I saw the flash of irritation in his eyes. "Janet was just saying how wonderful it would be if I joined the library board. With my legal expertise." "Oh yes, wonderful." The words tasted false on my tongue. Later that night, as James slept beside me, I slipped out of bed and retrieved the journal from its hiding place. I read it again by the dim light of my bedside lamp, processing my mother's words with a new perspective. She had been making plans to leave, to start over at 45. I was 65. Was it too late for such courage? The next morning, I waited until James left for his golf game before I began my search. I started in his home office, methodically going through filing cabinets and desk drawers. I found nothing unusual until I checked his laptop, a breach of privacy that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. His password was my birthday. A sentimental choice that made what I discovered next even more painful. Emails. Dozens of them, stretching back 3 years, between James and someone named Valerie. Their content ranged from mundane discussions of dinner plans to explicitly intimate exchanges that made my cheeks burn. There were photographs too. A woman perhaps 15 years younger than me, blonde and laughing, often in locations I recognized from James's business trips. And financial records. A condominium purchased in Phoenix 2 years ago. Regular transfers to an account I knew nothing about. Flight receipts, hotel reservations for 2. My hands shook as I closed the laptop. The parallels to my mother's situation were eerie. The unfaithful husband, the financial deceptions. History repeating itself in the very same house. But there was one crucial difference. I was not my mother, trapped by limited options and the conventions of an earlier era. I had my own career, my own pension. Our children were grown and independent. The house was in both our names. I had choices she could only dream of. For 3 days I said nothing. I tended my garden, prepared James's meals, and slept beside him while my mind worked, turning over possibilities. I reread my mother's journal each afternoon while he was gone, drawing strength from her words, her resolve. On the 4th day, I made an appointment with Barbara Chen, the best divorce attorney in the county. I opened my own bank account and transferred half of our joint savings. I called Michael and Sarah, asking them to visit as soon as possible. And I booked a flight to Phoenix. James noticed none of this. He continued his routine: work, golf, dinner, television, bed, while I orbited around him, playing my role while firming my resolve. When the day came, I chose the moment carefully. Sunday breakfast, his guard down, the newspaper creating the illusion of privacy. "I know about Valerie," I said calmly, pouring more coffee into his cup. "And the condo in Phoenix." The newspaper lowered slowly. James's face revealed nothing at first, then settled into a mask of indignation. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please don't insult me further by lying." My voice remained steady, surprising me with its strength. 3 years, James. Long enough to make plans, apparently. He folded the newspaper deliberately, buying time. "It's not what you think. It never is." I took a sip of my coffee. "I've seen the emails, photos, the financial records." His expression changed then, hardening into something cold and unfamiliar. "You had no right to go through my personal things. And you had no right to betray our marriage. Yet here we are." I set down my cup carefully. "Barbara Chen is expecting you to call. She'll handle the divorce proceedings." "Divorce?" He looked genuinely shocked. "Don't be ridiculous, Eleanor. We can work this out. The way my father worked things out with my mother. Until she died still planning her escape." Confusion flickered across his face. "What are you talking about?" I told him then about finding the journal, about my mother's discovered courage, about history's failed attempt to repeat itself. "I'm 65, James. Too old for new beginnings, some might say. But my mother was preparing to start over at 45, and she had far fewer advantages than I do." I stood, smoothing my napkin beside my plate. "I won't wait until my heart gives out before I find freedom." "You're being dramatic." His voice took on the patronizing tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "Where would you even go?" I smiled then, feeling lighter than I had in years. "That's the wonderful thing. Can go anywhere. I've already booked a flight to Italy. That cooking course in Tuscany I've talked about for years that you always dismissed as impractical. Michael and Sarah will meet me there next month." "And then what?" he demanded, anger finally breaking through his control. "You'll come crawling back when reality sets in." "No, James. I won't." I reached into my pocket and retrieved my mother's journal, placing it on the table between us. "You should read this. It might help you understand that some women don't crawl. They fly." I left him sitting there, staring at the journal, and went upstairs to finish packing. Through the bedroom window, I could see the hydrangea bed where I'd found my mother's final gift to me. Not just her words, but her example. The taxi arrived an hour later. James had retreated to his office, door firmly closed. I left my house key and wedding ring on the entry table with a note giving him Barbara's contact information. As the taxi pulled away, I looked back at the house on Maple Street. The creaking floors, the familiar rooms, the garden where secrets had waited patiently to be discovered. For a moment, grief squeezed my heart. Not for James or the marriage I was leaving, but for my mother and the freedom she never reached. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked. "The airport," I said, turning away from the past. "I have a plane to catch." In my suitcase, carefully wrapped between layers of clothing, was a small package addressed to Michael. Inside was my mother's journal and a letter from me, explaining everything. He would share it with Sarah. They would understand eventually, even if they were shocked at first. Understanding isn't always immediate. Sometimes it takes years or generations. Sometimes it takes finding a rusted lockbox in a garden, or the courage to open a laptop and face hard truths. As the taxi turned onto the main road, I felt my mother's presence beside me, approving. 2 women, separated by time but connected by blood and experience, finally taking flight. Eleanor Caldwell was leaving home. And for the first time in decades, she was going home to herself.